Um, Now it's working? Yes. So why comparison? By showing what is similar and what was different, we'll hopefully understand both histories better. And first, Werner Heisenberg. So Heisenberg was born in 1901 and was a staunch anti-communist all of his life. This included participating as a very young man in a Freikorps paramilitary unit fighting socialists and communists in Munich immediately after World War I. Heisenberg's breakthrough came in 1927 with his publication of the uncertainty principle, along with other fundamental contributions to the new quantum mechanics. He was appointed full professor at the University of Leipzig in 1928 at the young age of 27. There was a brief period when Heisenberg drew many promising theoretical physicists as graduate students or postdocs to Leipzig to study with him, including Felix Bloch, Rudolf Peierls, Isidor Rabi, John Slater, Edward Teller, Victor Weisskopf, and Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker. He was awarded the 1932 Nobel Prize in 1933, just after the Nazis came to power. Many colleagues, including Richard Courant and Heisenberg's mentor Max Born, were forced to leave Germany because of the Nazi civil service law. This included Heisenberg's non-Aryan, according to the Nazi legislation, postdoctoral and doctoral students, including his assistants Felix Bloch and Guido Beck. In 1937, Heisenberg was attacked for his connections to modern physics and Albert Einstein by his Nazi colleague and fellow Nobel laureate Johannes Stark. Stark wanted to stop Heisenberg's appointment as professor in Munich as successor to his mentor and Stark's archenemy, Arnold Sommerfeld. Stark attacked Heisenberg in an article in the SS weekly newspaper Das Schwarze Korps, the Black Corps. Yes, the SS had its own newspaper. You could buy it on newsstands, and people did buy it because they wanted to know what the SS was thinking and writing about. The article was titled White Jews in Science, which referred to German scientists under Jewish influence, in this case, the influence of Jewish physicists. Karl von Ossietzky was a socialist and journalist imprisoned in a concentration camp. While in the camp, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Hitler was so outraged that he ordered that henceforth no German could accept a Nobel Prize. By describing Heisenberg as the Ossietzky of physics, Stark both degraded Heisenberg's Nobel Prize and suggested that he belonged in a concentration camp. Ominously, the first part of the article ended with a clear threat, quote, Heisenberg is just one example among many others. They are all proxies for Judaism and German intellectual life and must disappear just like the Jews themselves, unquote. Now, Stark attacked many physicists. He attacked Arnold Sommerfeld. He attacked Max Planck. He attacked Max von Laue. But Heisenberg was different in that he fought back. Heisenberg used a family connection. His mother knew the mother of SS leader Heinrich Himmler to send Himmler a letter asking for his rehabilitation. As a result, Heisenberg had to endure a grueling investigation by the security service of the SS. The physicist asked Ludwig Prandtl, a respected aeronautical engineer with close connections to leading Nazis like Hermann Göring, for help. Prandtl then also intervened directly with Himmler with a letter using anti-Semitic rhetoric. So this is Prandtl writing to Himmler on Heisenberg's behalf. Among the non-Aryan researchers, quote, there were those of inferior rank who, with the industriousness characteristic of their race, trumpeted their trinkets, that such products disappear is only right and proper, unquote. But Prandtl went on, arguing that there also were non-Aryan researchers of the very highest rank who strove with great zeal to advance science and who had actually promoted it in the past. In Einstein's case, Prandtl went on, one must distinguish between the human being and the physicist. Quote, the physicist is first class through and through, but his early fame seems to have gone to his head considerably so that he has become unbearable as a human being, unquote. Now, Heisenberg had an informant in the SS process. He knew a physicist who was in the security service of the SS who was involved in the investigation. And he told Heisenberg that the report had been written and had been on Himmler's desk for 6 months and nothing had happened. And he told Heisenberg he thought that unfortunately Himmler was never going to respond. But only 9 days after Himmler received Prantel's letter, Heisenberg was rehabilitated by the SS and Himmler personally. This was July of 1938. Now, how did Heisenberg express his gratitude? In a letter to Himmler, in his letter to Himmler, Heisenberg admitted that, quote, I did not belong to any party and remained aloof from the National Socialist Revolution. Therefore, it did not seem right to me to join the party in order to enjoy advantages to which I was not entitled, unquote. Heisenberg could now have joined the Nazi Party or even the SS. He would have been very welcome in the SS. But he does something different. Heisenberg had referred to his service in the Freikorps in his letter to Himmler. Now the physicist went further and volunteered for military service during the Czechoslovakian crisis in September 1938. And as I tell my own students, one of the hardest things about history is to try and forget things you already know. You all already know that at the Munich meeting in 1938, the British and the French gave the Sudetenland to Hitler and military conflict was avoided. But it didn't have to end that way, and Hitler himself wanted military conflict with Czechoslovakia. Heisenberg was standing on the front with a rifle. Uh, if it had, if the conflict had begun, he could easily have been killed, and his place in the history of science would look very different. Now, only a few months later, in the summer of 1939, Heisenberg visited the United States, where he met emigre colleagues like Samuel Gaudsmit and Enrico Fermi, as well as American scientists. Heisenberg's colleagues could not understand why the physicist would return to Germany. They all told him, don't go back, stay. Setting aside the fact that Heisenberg already had a family with small children, back in Germany, he probably did not mention the SS investigation and rehabilitation or his military service to his foreign colleagues. Now, in the center is a schematic diagram. I don't need to explain to you that the schematic diagram does not try to show the probability of certain events. The schematic diagram simply tries to show all possible events. In the center, this is a diagram Heisenberg used in several popular lectures in 1942 and 1943 to German political and military leaders. This came after Heisenberg and Army Ordnance, which had been running the project, came to the conclusion that it was not possible, it would not be possible for Germany to make atomic bombs during the war. The German war economy certainly simply could not make that kind of an effort. Immediately after this decision, this is the winter of 41-42, when the war starts to turn bad for Germany. Some of the scientists in the German uranium project begin to be drafted to be sent to the front as common soldiers. Now, Heisenberg managed to reverse some of these call-ups, but it was now clear to him and his colleagues that they needed to persuade the military and political leaders of the importance of their research. So thus this diagram. On the left is a schematic diagram of a nuclear reactor. On the right is a pure mass of uranium-235, and Heisenberg in his lecture pointed out that if you had a pure mass of uranium-235 or of plutonium, it would be an explosive of, quote, utterly unimaginable effect, unquote. However, it's important to note that he did not promise to deliver atomic bombs in time to help Germany win the war. Rather, he argued that because the Americans were probably working on this, the German research needed to continue. Here on the left is a rare photograph from the German uranium project. Standing is Air Force Field Marshal Erhard Milch. To his left, seated with his face partially obscured, is Minister of Armaments Albert Speer. Sitting in the foreground in a civilian suit with his back to the viewer is Heisenberg, who gave his talk here. The result of this meeting was that Speer gave the German uranium researchers more support, including helping acquire materials and labor, as well as more security from being called up and sent to the front as common soldiers. Heisenberg subsequently wrote a letter to his wife about these events. Quote, "Those were eventful days in Berlin. The powerful elite of the country were truly gathered in Harnack House, practically the entire Armaments Council and many other powerful people. It went better than all expectations. The talks from Walter Botha and me obviously made a strong impression. In any case, afterwards we were treated personally and professionally fabulously. This is all very strange and eerie. Suddenly, I do not need to worry at all about the entire Leonard Stark clique, that is the followers of Johannes Stark, and can push through almost everything that is important to me," unquote. I think this is a good example of the concept of hubris. As part of Heisenberg's rehabilitation, Himmler had ordered that he be allowed to publish an article in the Zeitschrift für die gesamte Naturwissenschaft, the journal for the entirety of science. This was a journal controlled by the advocates of what was called Aryan physics, the followers of Stark. In 1943, long after the influence of Stark and his followers had faded, Heisenberg still insisted on publishing this article. In a postscript to his letter to Heisenberg, Himmler had added, quote, "I consider it right, however, if in the future you clearly separate the recognition of scientific research results from the human and political attitude of the researcher in front of your listeners," unquote. That is, if you want to teach relativity theory, that is fine, but do not praise Einstein. Now, although Heisenberg did not use anti-Semitic rhetoric like Prantl, this is why I gave you the example from Prantl's letter in his article, he nevertheless sacrificed Einstein the person in order to rehabilitate Einstein's science. And this is a quotation from his article. So this was a publication. "A physical theory makes statements about reality, that is its only content. Reality is independent of theories, no matter how they came about. America would have been discovered if Columbus had never lived. The theory of electrical phenomena would have been found without Maxwell, electric waves without Hertz. For the discoverer can change nothing about the facts. In the same way, the theory of relativity would undoubtedly have been developed without Einstein. Precisely here, it can be shown in detail that other scholars had already turned their thoughts in the same direction. The work of Voigt, Lorentz, and Poincaré already came very close to the complete formulation of the special theory of relativity. Therefore, regarding the correction of the correctness of a theory, the history of its discovery is best left completely aside." During the war, Heisenberg took many lecture trips outside of Germany, including famously to Copenhagen in 1941, but that's another talk. I'm not going to go into detail about that today. And more ominously, to places like the Institute for German Work in the East, in Krakow, in the general government, which had been Poland. The Germans had closed the University of Krakow, deported all the faculty to concentration camps, and then set up their own research institute there. Now, wherever he went, and Heisenberg spoke in Denmark, in Hungary, in Holland, in Switzerland, in Slovakia, he was celebrated and honored. He also left the unmistakable impression that he was a German nationalist and supported the war. As Lisa Meitner wrote to her Swiss colleague Paul Scher immediately after the war, She described the, quote, very peculiar things, unquote, she had heard from younger Danish colleagues about Heisenberg's visit in September of 1941. Quote, he was completely infatuated with the chimera of a German victory and set forth a theory of superior men and nations over which Germany was meant to rule, even though he did describe the occupation of Denmark and Norway as regrettable, unquote. Shortly after the end of the war, Heisenberg's Dutch colleague Hendrik Casimir reported that the German physicist had known about the concentration camps and the plundering of other countries, but still wanted Germany to dominate Europe. In fact, during a visit to the Netherlands in 1943, Heisenberg had said, quote, history legitimates Germany's rule over Europe. Only a nation that exercises its rule ruthlessly can sustain itself. For this reason, there are only two possibilities, Germany and Russia, and then perhaps a Europe under German leadership would be the lesser evil, unquote. But if these comments seem rather harsh, a letter Heisenberg wrote to his wife Elizabeth at around the same time as he was in Holland provides context for his remarks. So this is in his private letter to Elizabeth, quote, you see, my thoughts are once again entirely on the war. It's becoming difficult for me to detach myself mentally from all the terrible things that are happening. I no longer have the strength to concentrate on scientific work, unquote. Many of the emigre and foreign colleagues, both during and after the war, who criticized Heisenberg for his comments during his foreign lectures, seem to have failed to take into account that Heisenberg, who needed to protect his family, could not express his opinions openly. There certainly was a danger that he would be overheard and that his statements might subsequently be reported to the Gestapo. Now, this does not necessarily mean that Heisenberg did not believe what he was saying, but rather that he could not be expected to make defeatist statements, contradict Nazi policies, or admit to knowing about atrocities. Whether out of conviction or caution, he generally said the right thing to avoid problems with the Gestapo and other German authorities. Oops. After Heisenberg's rehabilitation by the SS and his meeting with Speer, his star rose steadily in the Third Reich during the war, accumulating several honors, including financial awards from the Nazi state. Yes, the Nazis intimidated and threatened, but they also rewarded and bribed. Heisenberg's 1942 appointment as director at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Physics was followed by a call to a professorship at the University of Berlin the same year. The honors continued with election to the Prussian Academy of Sciences in March of 1942, selection as a corresponding member of the German Academy for Aviation Research in September, and award of the Copernicus Prize in June of 1943. This prize was worth 2.5 times Heisenberg's annual salary. In December of 1943, Hitler followed Minister of Armament Speer's recommendation and awarded Heisenberg the War Service Cross, First Class. The following May, Heisenberg was featured in a front-page article in Joseph Goebbels' most prestigious propaganda magazine, Das Reich. I am not saying that Heisenberg became an enthusiastic Nazi. I'm saying that beginning in 1942, the Nazis began to enthusiastically honor, reward, and support him. So now, tragedy. When the war was finally over in Europe, Germany and Heisenberg's beloved Munich were destroyed. 10 German scientists, including Heisenberg, were interned in an English country house immediately after the war. When they heard the news of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they recognized that their work with isotope separation in nuclear reactors was second class. In 1947, Heisenberg was attacked by Samuel Gaudsmit, who had been the scientific head of the Alsos mission, the scientific intelligence gathering unit created at the end of the war and charged with investigating the German atomic bomb efforts. Gaudsmit accused Heisenberg and Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker of, quote, compromising with the Nazis, unquote. And although today people often ask, why did they work on nuclear weapons? That wasn't the question that people were asking immediately after the war. Their immigrant American colleagues, many of them had also worked on nuclear weapons. The criticism was you worked on nuclear weapons for this kind of a regime. You had worked on nuclear weapons for the Nazis. You had compromised with the Nazis. I have seen no evidence that Heisenberg and his colleagues in the uranium project regarded the fate of the European Jews as a tragedy that affected them, except that some people were using it to discredit Germany and Germans. Now, after the war, Heisenberg enjoyed a great deal of prestige, at least in Germany. I say at least in Germany because many of his emigre and American colleagues were still a little ambivalent about him in the post-war years. Now, there are two things in the 50s that reinforced each other. On one hand, there was a book written by Robert Jungk, Brighter Than a Thousand Suns, and the other is the so-called Göttingen Declaration by 18 West German physicists. The image shows Walter Gerlach, Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, and Otto Hahn just before they met with Adenauer after their declaration. And I'll get to the declaration in a minute. I love this picture of Weizsäcker standing in the middle. If you look at his face, he has this smile that the press are taking a picture of me. I have to smile now. According to Jung in his book, Heisenberg and Weizsäcker traveled to Copenhagen in 1941 to convince their Danish colleague Niels Bohr to help them prevent all nuclear weapons. This is something I call the Copenhagen legend. The Göttingen Declaration refers to the public declaration by 18 West German scientists that they would not participate in the research, production, or deployment of West German nuclear weapons. The public refusal by the 18 scientists to help Konrad Adenauer's government to acquire nuclear weapons made more plausible Jung's claim that during the Third Reich, Heisenberg, Weizsäcker, and their colleagues had tried to stop all atomic bombs. In turn, the book made these scientists appear consistent, both under National Socialism and in the new West German Federal Republic. They had supported civilian research on nuclear fission, not military. In 1993, the author Thomas Powers published a book called Heisenberg's War that went even further than Jung and claimed that Heisenberg and Weizsäcker had deliberately tried to stop Hitler from getting atomic bombs, that they had resisted Hitler. I don't recommend Powers' book, but it's important because it inspired the playwright Michael Frayn to write his prize-winning play Copenhagen, in which the ghosts of Heisenberg, Bohr, and Bohr's wife Margaret come together long after their deaths to discover what Heisenberg was trying to do when he visited Bohr in 1941. Now, some of you may have seen this play. There are three different versions of events, and I think this was Frayn's attempt to create an analogy to Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. The first version of events follows the theme, was Heisenberg trying to persuade Bohr to cooperate with the German authorities in occupied Denmark? And that actually was true. Heisenberg did do that. The middle scenario is kind of in the middle. And the third scenario suggests that Heisenberg deliberately denied important information to Albert Speer and others because he didn't want to make atomic bombs for Hitler. Now, this play can be interpreted in many different ways, and of course, Frayn claimed that himself. I met him at a conference a few years afterward. But in fact, the play is linear. one aversion comes last. If the play had been reversed, if first the audience would hear about maybe Heisenberg didn't want to make atomic bombs, then the part in the middle, and then it ended with maybe Heisenberg was trying to get bored to collaborate, the play would have a very different meaning for the audience. But it probably also would not be as good of a play because the way the play is written here, it has a happy ending. Now, J. Robert Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer was born 3 years later than Heisenberg in 1904 and made many important contributions to modern physics, including early work on black holes, repeatedly coming close but never achieving the status that might have earned him the Nobel Prize. And in fact, I was recently in the archives of the Swedish Academy of Sciences, and I realized that I can make this more precise. The question is not why did Oppenheimer never win a Nobel Prize? The question is why was he not nominated for a Nobel Prize? You cannot win a Nobel Prize unless you're nominated for it, and no one was nominating Oppenheimer. Between 1927 and 1943, Oppenheimer split his time as a physics professor between Caltech in Los Angeles and UC Berkeley, also in California. His peers recognized him as one of the leading theoretical physicists in America, the person who had brought quantum mechanics to America, and as an excellent teacher. Like many intellectuals in America, Oppenheimer flirted with communism during the interwar period and supported communist sympathizing organizations. Many of his former associates, including his brother, his wife, and a lover, were all members of the American Communist Party. In 1943, Oppenheimer was chosen by General Groves to be the scientific head of the Los Alamos Laboratory to build an atomic bomb, even though he had not done anything in the past to suggest that he would be very good at that. But fortunately for Oppenheimer, who was surrounded by and led very many other good scientists, he proved to be an excellent scientific manager. This Time magazine article, Time magazine was probably the most popular news magazine at the time in America. So this 1945 Time magazine article and cover introduced Oppenheimer to the American public as the father of the atomic bomb. However, the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the fact that, as was now clear to Oppenheimer, the atomic bombs he had helped create had been used against an already defeated enemy, the physicist and many of his colleagues began to question whether they had created an, quote, evil thing, unquote, that comes from a speech of Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer now worked very hard to influence how nuclear weapons would develop and be used in the post-war world. Initially, he was influenced by Niels Bohr's concept of an open world, where nations would openly share scientific information and collaborate peacefully. Oppenheimer helped draft the Acheson-Lilienthal report along the lines of the open world for the Truman administration. But the Truman administration was reluctant to give up the American monopoly on nuclear weapons and instead presented a different plan, the Baruch Plan, to the United Nations. This plan would have required the Soviet Union to agree to monitoring designed to keep them from making nuclear weapons while the Americans kept theirs. This was unacceptable to the Soviets, who insisted that the US must first agree to prohibit the production and use of atomic weapons and destroy its existing stockpiles before any system of international control and inspection was established. So there was no agreement shortly after the war to stop the arms race, the nuclear arms race. Oppenheimer did not support the development of the hydrogen bomb, but what is important to understand is that he was not a pacifist. Instead, he was advocating for a large expansion of the American arsenal of atomic bombs. He argued we need to make better atomic bombs and more atomic bombs. And his response to don't what if the Soviets one day get a hydrogen bomb was that if we have enough atomic bombs, we'll still be able to deter a Soviet attack. Oppenheimer was appointed to and became chairman of the General Advisory Committee to the new Atomic Energy Commission. This was the most important scientific committee with regard to nuclear matters. Oppenheimer also gave prominent public speeches and published articles on atomic issues. Now, Oppenheimer thereby attempted to influence nuclear weapons policy of the United States from both inside and outside the government. There were other people who had access to classified materials, but they were not making public statements. They were people who were making public statements, participating in a public debate about policy, but they did not have access to classified materials. Oppenheimer had both. For example, in public speeches, and he usually then subsequently published them as articles in influential journals. Oppenheimer regularly referred to the classified information he could not share with his audience, but which supported his position in arguments. Now, in other words, I can't share this information with you, but it would support my argument that we need to do ... Oppenheimer also criticized the US government for lack of candor. According to him, there was important information that the government could and should share with the American people. Now, this is really what brought Oppenheimer down, because the Eisenhower government was not prepared to tolerate this. Oppenheimer made many political enemies, including Louis Strauss, the new head of the AEC under President Eisenhower. And some of you may have seen the Oppenheimer movie and know this figure. In 1954, the Atomic Energy Commission held a hearing on whether or not to revoke Oppenheimer's security clearance. In a process planned and manipulated by Strauss, Oppenheimer was attacked for disloyalty because of his ties to communists and his lack of enthusiasm for developing the hydrogen bomb. Oppenheimer was famously betrayed by his ambitious colleague Edward Teller. The hearing ended by revoking Oppenheimer's security clearance, and as Strauss had desired, resulted in Oppenheimer's public humiliation and almost complete loss of influence within the United States government. This 1954 Time magazine cover shows Oppenheimer as he was suffering through his security hearing. He seems to have aged a lot in the 9 years. Robert Jung's book, Brighter Than a Thousand Suns, is again interesting in this regard. Now, Jung's book was mostly about the American Manhattan Project. He only briefly spoke about the German project by way of comparison. Jung was in America in 52, 53, 54. He experienced McCarthyism. He fled Germany initially because of his Jewish background, came to America, became an American citizen. After the McCarthy period, he moved to Switzerland and became a Swiss citizen. Now Jung's book is very critical of the witch hunt during the McCarthy period and of the Oppenheimer hearing. In fact, Jung's book was a bestseller and was one of the things that publicized McCarthyism to many readers inside and outside of America. But what's interesting is that Jung is also critical of Oppenheimer. He portrays him as an amoral scientist who would pursue anything that was, quote, technically sweet, unquote. And of course, that phrase, technically sweet, comes from Oppenheimer's hearings. At one point, he's asked, if scientists were ambivalent about the atomic bomb, why did they keep working on them? And Oppenheimer's response was, well, if something is technically sweet, scientists want to pursue it to the end to see if it works. Jung also called Oppenheimer a 20th century Faust, someone who had made a pact with the devil. After being humiliated by Strauss and the Eisenhower administration, the successor to Eisenhower, President John F. Kennedy, decided to honor and thereby publicly rehabilitate Oppenheimer with the award of the Fermi Medal. Since Kennedy had in the meantime been assassinated, President Lyndon Johnson presented the award. Nearly a decade had passed since his security clearance hearing, and no one would have suggested that Oppenheimer begin advising the government again. Oppenheimer was now known as much for his opposition to the hydrogen bomb as his responsibility for the atomic bomb. In 1964, the German playwright Heinrich Kippert play, quote, In the Matter of Robert Oppenheimer, unquote. That was the title of the published version of his security hearings. Heinrich Kippert's play was telecast on West German television and was subsequently staged after Oppenheimer's death on Broadway. Kippert describes the physicist as a martyr who wondered whether he had betrayed the spirit of science by working for the military. Also making a comparison to Faust, the playwright has Oppenheimer say at the end of the play, quote, "We have done the work of the devil," unquote. Christopher Nolan's 2023 film Oppenheimer examines the life and work of his protagonist, jumping back and forth between the pre-war and wartime work on the bomb to a security hearing during the McCarthyist years of the Cold War. Nolan suggests that Oppenheimer was martyred for his failure to support the development of the hydrogen bomb. So, comparison. First, I'm going to compare the German and American work on isotope separation. This was a German achievement. By the end of the war, they had 2 or 3 sets of double centrifuges, which were able to slightly enrich the percentage of uranium-235 in very small samples of uranium. So they had demonstrated in principle that this would work, but they were very far away from producing enough uranium-235 for a bomb. On the other hand, this design is, in a sense, the intellectual ancestor to the centrifuges that are in places like Iran today. Now, this is a comparison with the American isotope separation plants. For electromagnetic separation, this was one of 11 different units. You can look at the ladder to get a sense of the scale. The building on the right, the gas diffusion plant, you can look at the roads for a sense of the scale. At the time that building was built, it was one of the largest buildings in the world. So beginning in 1943, the Americans began investing millions into isotope separation. There's really no comparison between the scales of the two projects thereafter. Now, plutonium production, a comparison of the German and American nuclear reactors. This is what the Germans managed to do by the end of the war. A reactor experiment, a lattice of uranium cubes immersed in heavy water that came close to, but did not quite achieve a self-sustaining chain reaction. Now, the first American nuclear reactor that did achieve a chain reaction was also crude, but the middle is an image of the second reactor built, designed by engineers and scientists already running in 1943. This was a pilot plant for plutonium production. On the right, that whole complex is what they called a reactor. There were 4 such complexes or 4 reactors at Hanford, Washington. This is also in operation. This goes into operation early in 1944 and is the place that has produced most of the plutonium for the American nuclear weapons project. Now, the profound difference in scale between the German and the American projects can be explained by the effects of the war. On the left, you see a picture of Hamburg in 1943. The physical chemist Paul Hartek's institute was in Hamburg. Hartek was in charge of the uranium isotope separation research. He was also in charge of developing new processes for heavy water production. Several times the work was interrupted. After one bombing, Hartek and his colleagues barely escaped with their lives. Um, Although through the summer of 1942, the respective research projects in Germany and America had been comparable, thereafter in Germany, the destructive effects of the war, the bombing, the shortages of manpower and materials, etc., ground the research to a halt. Now, this is Los Alamos. It was only opened in April of 1943, but very quickly it became a large, elaborate, multi-purpose interdisciplinary laboratory, hundreds of scientists and engineers. The Americans did not have to worry about being bombed. They could use the resources of the U.S. Army to set it up. They also had massive industrial resources. Um, it's striking that at about the time the Germans essentially recognized that making an atomic bomb was impossible, the Americans began making these large investments to make an atomic bomb. Now, political attacks. Heisenberg's anti-communism was unproblematic. It was unproblematic in Germany to be anti-communist after World War I. It was unproblematic to be anti-communist in Weimar. It certainly was unproblematic to be anti-communist in the Third Reich, and was also unproblematic to be anti-communist in the post-war West German Federal Republic. But Oppenheimer's communist sympathies were not. They were problematic. Oppenheimer had humiliated Strauss, with whom he knew he would have to work. While Heisenberg had dismissed Stark as old and unable to follow the mathematics, which is about the worst thing a physicist can say of another physicist, Heisenberg had always been very respectful to authority, including under the Nazis, and no one in their right mind disrespected the SS or Himmler. But what I would argue was most important was the scientists' utility for the respective regimes. Heisenberg was attacked by Stark, who, although an enthusiastic Nazi of long standing, was both no longer a productive physicist and proving problematic for the regime. Stark quickly lost all of his influence because of infighting with other Nazis within the government. When Heisenberg was attacked, he could use his potential usefulness to the Nazi regime, in particular with regard to training the next generation of theoretical physicists, as an argument for his rehabilitation. And when the uranium project began, Heisenberg had even more reason to be able to argue that he was important. On the eve of the German invasion of Poland in September 1939, Himmler had personally decided that Heisenberg was valuable and that Germany could not afford to lose him, noting in a letter to his subordinate Reinhard Heydrich that they, quote, could not afford to silence this man. Oppenheimer was betrayed by Teller, who would be useful in developing the hydrogen bomb. During the war, Oppenheimer had been indispensable, but was attacked when this was no longer the case after he had made clear that he would not help build the hydrogen bomb. The Eisenhower administration was willing to make an example of Oppenheimer and thereby discourage other scientists in America from publicly opposing the hydrogen bomb. So, conclusion. Comparison shows us that Heisenberg and Oppenheimer were similar in some respects and very different in others. They were both ambitious, and after the discovery of nuclear fission, because of the inherent political power of the science they were pursuing, became very influential. They served very different kinds of masters. Heisenberg, the National Socialists during their aggressive and ultimately genocidal war, Oppenheimer, the U.S. Army and government after Pearl Harbor and Hitler's declaration of war against the United States, but that ironically does not appear to have made much of a difference. Perhaps the most striking difference is that after suffering dangerous political attacks, Heisenberg fought back hard and after his rehabilitation ended up working more closely with the National Socialists. After the war, he was criticized for this, but managed with the help of the legend of Copenhagen to overcome his post-war ostracism and in the public mind become the hero who had tried to stop all nuclear weapons. Oppenheimer appeared to accept his fate at the hands of Strauss and the AEC. The filmmaker Nolan hints at the end of his film that this may have been deliberate on Oppenheimer's part. By becoming a martyr, he would be forgiven Hiroshima and Nagasaki. For both men and our perception of them, legends were as important as their actual words and actions. Thus, both Heisenberg and Oppenheimer are perhaps not surprisingly portrayed as heroic figures. But of course, if you think about it, this heroism was arguably flawed. Heisenberg was working for the Nazis, and Oppenheimer made the bombs used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki possible. Thank you.